Yes, the church really does have a helpline for bishops and stake presidents and other leaders to be able to call and get advice on how to handle cases of abuse, including legal advice. Yep, all of those are true. But what this podcast, Heaven's Helpline, does is takes those and see, this means they don't care about children. So I'm going to give you some broader context to all of those things. If the only information you had to listen to was what is being presented in that podcast, you might believe it, that the church is bad. You might be horrified of, wait, my church does these things? So I want to give you some reasonable ways to think about some of these terrible, terrible events that show it's not exactly as they are making it out to be. Hello, I'm Jennifer Roach Lees. Today we are going to talk about a podcast that has gotten a little bit of traction. It's called Heaven's Helpline. It's a show about our church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and how it handles cases of sexual abuse. The show is made in New Zealand, though you wouldn't totally know that. Most of what it talks about are things that happened here in the U.S., though they do get a little New Zealand-specific information in there too, which actually is rather interesting. I read and write a lot about issues that involve sexual abuse in our church, so of course I was interested in listening to this podcast. It's 6 episodes long, just a mini-series essentially, and they make a lot of claims about our church, about the people in our church, the average members, about the leadership of our church, and how we handle various things. I want to go through the claims that they make and talk about them. Some of the things they say are true. Absolutely. Some of the things they say actually happened. But frequently, in this show especially, they're using those true events to draw conclusions that are not true. And they could use some additional context. So that's what we're going to do today. I want to talk to you about these things. I know this is hard stuff to listen to. It's hard stuff to talk about. And if you pay attention to this issue at all, you have heard in the media, online, in discussions, people talking about how our church handles abuse. And a lot of it is just wildly taken out of context. Sexual abuse is terrible. The stories that this podcast and others talk about are horrific. The victims in those stories deserve nothing but compassion. They are 100% to be believed and cared for. Nothing I have ever thought reading any of their stories is that they're just trying to get the church. They're trying to hurt people. They're trying to get money. None of the victim stories are anything like that. They're actual, real people who've been really hurt by experiences happening to them. And they deserve our compassion and they deserve our prayers. And at the same time, people outside of those situations, people like these podcasters we're going to talk about, are using those stories to make conclusions about our church that, for the most part, just aren't true. So I want to give you the fuller context. This section, section 1, I'm going to give you an overview of kind of all 6 episodes of this podcast. Each episode after this will go through the claims more specifically, but I want you to have a nice kind of arc of what's happening here. The show makes many, many claims about why the church is bad. Essentially, that's their thesis in this show. The church is very bad. Some of those claims have to do with sexual abuse, and this podcast, these 6 episodes, are billed as they're attacking this issue of sexual abuse. However, many of the claims that they make don't have anything to do with abuse, and actually kind of read like a list of gripes about the church, things that they don't like about our church. And honestly, there are many things that are common to all churches, no matter what type of faith they practice. So when you listen, it's hard not to pick up the sense of, well, these folks might not like any church. One of their gripes is that our church teaches people to listen to the Holy Ghost, to listen to the Spirit, to help them make decisions and guide them through their lives. And they think that's sort of ridiculous. And certainly our church is not the only church that teaches that you should listen and try to hear God's voice, or that you should listen through the Scriptures. And they find all of these things to be silly and not very sophisticated and definitely worth looking down on. So you get a lot of claims like that. Some of those we'll talk through, and some of them are they're just so silly they're hardly worth the attention. One of the tools this podcast is using is they pile on claim after claim after claim after claim before they ever start talking about abuse. So if you were a listener who had no idea about the church or what it was about, you would spend the first full 2 episodes and well into the 3rd episode just hearing story after story after story about how various people kind of think the church is bad, setting you up for when they hit you with the really emotional sexual abuse stories that it just would send you, the listener, right over the edge into a belief of, oh, what a terrible church this is. That's kind of how they have set it up. The church is bad because they disagree with the teachings. That is sort of the theme of episode 1. We disagree with what the church stands for. Their episode 1 isn't talking about abuse or how it's handled or how it's prevented or the impact that it has had on victims or families. It's just 45 minutes of here's why the church is kind of weird at best or really, really bad at worst. So we're going to cover many of these claims in this series. I do want to say everything I'm going to talk about here today are my opinions. I don't speak for FAIR. I certainly don't speak for the church. I've read about these issues. I'm a licensed mental health therapist. I work with clients who have gone through similar things. I myself have gone through similar things. My opinions are all my own. Now, to be frank, the host and producer of this podcast doesn't quite seem to understand our church. I think he understands churches in general, perhaps. And there's a lot that is almost humorous. You, member of the church, you might listen to it and be like, wait, what? At one point, episode 2, it's the 4-minute and 53-second mark. The host of the podcast says this. He says, for Mormons, the temple is a huge deal. There are various rituals, ordinances they're called, that can be done nowhere except the temple. That includes baptisms, confirmations, priesthood ordinations, and the weekly sacrament. So if you're a member of the church or if you've ever attended the church, like you know perfectly well, weekly sacrament is not something we do in the temple. And I'm sort of poking fun at them a tiny little bit, but it should be a clue to you. The people who are speaking to you in this podcast, Heaven's Helpline, kind of don't understand the ins and outs of exactly what they're talking about, and they reveal that almost straight away in this podcast. So you should have a lot of questions already in your mind when you're listening to them. If someone makes a claim about the church that can be corrected with a simple Google search, you should probably have some questions. There's literally a sign on the outside of every building that says visitors welcome. And welcome to what? To sacrament meeting, of course, the most important meeting that we would do in a week. So the idea that we love temples and only the special people get to go into temples, and they make that claim eventually, and that's where you have to go to take weekly sacrament. It's just silly. So their episode 1 is 45 minutes. It's introducing their larger point that they don't like the church because they don't like our beliefs and our practices. They think tithing is bad. The expectations for behavior are bad. Having a bishop in and of itself is bad. Having an authority structure is bad. And it kind of goes on and on and on. They certainly show their hand here when they say, towards the end of episode 1, they say church members are, quote, are not normal. And they go on to describe it's because of how nice they are and that church members deserve to be made fun of for that. Their point is sort of, they're not very sophisticated, they're just nice, and they just do what they're told. They do not like our church, they do not like the people in our church. Their episode 2, they finally start hinting towards some things about abuse, but in this episode, it's not abuse that the church has anything to do with. They tell a number of stories, and they're bad stories. They're terrible. They're sad. There's real victims in these stories. For example, a woman tells a story about her emotionally and physically abusive father. And like many abusive fathers, he's kind of great in public. A lot of people like him. He's sort of charismatic, but he's a monster at home. And she admits that her and her siblings never tell anyone about this. Their family was members of the church. And she feels upset and bad that nobody saw what was happening and reached out to help her. Now, she has a right to be upset about her father living this double life, right? But he wasn't living it because the church taught him to. And this podcast makes the implication that that's what it was, that he had learned these things, how to be abusive to his family, from the church. And if that were true, wouldn't all fathers in all homes be abusive? And that's just is not the case in our church, of course. The father, in this case, he was a member of our church, and he did use his religious reasoning on his children to perpetrate his abuse, but not because the church taught him to do that. The church taught him quite the opposite. One of their implications in this is not only did the church teach him this, but the church should be responsible for every bad father who is abusive behind closed doors, no matter how slight his interaction with the church is. And none of that really makes any sense. You wouldn't claim that every act of abuse that's committed by the parents whose children all attend the same elementary school, you wouldn't say the elementary school is responsible for that, right? Just because they have that thing in common. Another example in this episode is that they talk about this woman. She's an adult, and she has proposed marriage by the young man that she has been seeing. She says they're not that serious. She was surprised by the proposal of marriage. It was too quick. She is hesitant to accept his proposal, but eventually she agrees to marry him. She's a grown adult. They get married. She frames that she got proposed to. She wasn't quite ready for it, and she herself agreed to it. She frames that as that is in and of itself abuse. The church encourages marriage. They encouraged him towards marriage. She was the object of his desire for marriage, and therefore she was manipulated into this. And I mean, to be honest, it sounds like a terrible story. Their marriage was not great, but not because that man was doing what the church told him to do. They go on to have a bad marriage because of choices that he makes and some of the choices that she makes. She also frames it as abuse because she was taught from childhood that she should pray about decisions and follow the spiritual promptings that she received. And she frames that as abuse, saying that made it harder for her to eventually separate from her husband because she believed she had received a prompting that she should marry him. So she looks back on that experience now and sees that as manipulation. It's her story. She gets to tell her own story. She's welcome to do that. However, I think most reasonable people looking at that would say that's not what following spiritual promptings means. We are talking about an adult woman here, by the way, not a child. She certainly had the ability to say yes or no to a marriage proposal or get herself in or out of a marriage as she saw fit. So that's what they do in episode 2. They tell us some really bad stories, and they're tangentially related to the church, and they put all the blame on the church. Episode 3, theirs, is when we actually start talking about sexual abuse of minors, which is what Heaven's Helpline is billed as. Everything up until this point have been examples of members acting against what they had been taught in church, and then the people they hurt blaming the church for it. Or it has also been just a long list of gripes that the hosts of the show all seem to share and kind of make fun of. Episode 2 is it's not anything that's really original. Tithing is bad. Believers are foolish and gullible. Following scripture is not a great way to live your life. Listening to the Holy Ghost isn't a real thing. There's sort of this mocking, not just of our church, but really honestly of many, many churches. But here, finally, in chapter 3, we're going to talk about how the church handles abuse. And the really interesting part to me in this one is many of the things they say happened actually happened. They cite facts of real court cases that really happened. But they do it with this slight twist of, and of course this proves the church is bad, without filling in any of the logical steps about how this proves that. They move on to episode 4, and they start talking about a case you have probably heard of. Maybe you have heard me talk about, and it's a case that happened in Bisbee, Arizona, a number of years ago. Episode 4, the point of it is this case is the ultimate in proving that the church is very bad. Their main claim is that the church only wants to protect itself, its money and reputation, and that vulnerable children or adults who are vulnerable in some reason gather no importance whatsoever. You really start to see a pattern here. They talk about facts that are true. A man from Arizona really did abuse his own children in terrible, terrible, horrific ways. Yes, the church really does have a helpline for bishops and stake presidents and other leaders to be able to call and get advice on how to handle cases of abuse, including legal advice. Yep, all of those are true. But what this podcast, Heaven's Helpline, does is takes those and see, this means they don't care about children. So I'm going to give you some broader context to all of those things. If the only information you had to listen to was what is being presented in that podcast, you might believe it, that the church is bad. You might be horrified of, wait, my church does these things? I want to give you some reasonable ways to think about some of these terrible, terrible events that show it's not exactly as they are making it out to be. Episode 5 of their show, we get into details about the helpline and why they think that's bad. We hear this, it's a very heartbreaking story about this couple in New Zealand, and they believe a young man in their ward has been abusing younger kids. And they try to bring this to the attention of their ward leadership, and it doesn't go anywhere, really. It's a heartbreaking story. There were opportunities missed to catch on to what this kid was doing and to stop him, and those opportunities just were missed. It's a terrible story for everyone involved. There's no denying the tragedy here. However, the next bit of logic the show uses is rather strange. They claim that the church should have a hotline for victims or for others with knowledge of abuse to call. And they want it to do exactly what 911, in New Zealand it's 111 apparently, they want it to do what 911 is already set up to do. There's a national hotline through which you can call and report crimes, including sexual abuse crimes. It's 911. Every person in within hearing distance of my voice has access, most likely, to calling 911. The church does not, and in my opinion, should not, try to recreate the 911 program. That is not what the church is about. Further, their logic here is really confusing because on the one hand, they do go to pains to say that wards or any individual church should not do an in-house investigation when abuse happens, which is something I absolutely agree with them on. But then they want the church to set up an internal 911 system to call and report crimes of abuse. So I'm not quite sure how they're making that logic leap there. When we get to covering this part, we'll get way deeper into all of that. The couple in this story, they're mad that they had to call 111. That's what it is in New Zealand. They had to call 111 instead of calling the church. But if you have a crime to report, 911 in America is the number that you call. You don't call your bishop to report a crime, right? That's not his job. Wouldn't it be weird if the church was trying to set up a parallel police department? This episode, it also makes me laugh a little bit because the host talks about, he's a journalist, he works for a newspaper. He talks about how he had to really dig deep into his bag of journalistic tricks in order to produce a very top secret piece of information. And the fact that the church has a helpline that leaders in New Zealand can access and that it has a New Zealand phone number. That's his big reveal, his big, what he had to dig into his journalistic bag of tricks for was that there's a helpline for New Zealand as well. I giggle a little bit here because I certainly am not a journalist, and I found the number with a Google search in about 1.4 seconds. But the host is very, very proud of himself that he was able to rely on his journalism training and find the number of the New Zealand version of the church's helpline. I just giggle and think it's funny. Their last episode, their episode 6, it moves away from talking about sexual abuse at all We really only get conversation about sexual abuse in 3 of the 6 episodes, by the way. It talks about why people leave the church and presents a pretty overall hopeless opinion that the church could ever do any good, that the bad far outweighs the good, and that it really is just something that should be left to rot. Essentially, that's their final summation of the church. So that's the broad overview of what is coming up. See each of my individual segments for more detail on each of those.